Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Michael Humbrock. I'm a researcher at the University of Glasgow, and this is the second seminar in the ongoing seminar, Just Tour seminar series, where we're hoping to explore a range of different themes and work from people engaged with justice in tourism. Today's seminar is going to explore the role of justice in understanding human-environment relationships. Just to give you a bit of background and lead into the discussion today, I think especially starting with environmental justice, justice research has been quite important in helping to highlight community rights and inequities with communities who have been impacted by tourism and especially their environmental resources. But since then, we've seen a multitude of different perspectives on justice and human-environment relationships that have emerged from justice research that's covered issues from coastal and landscape degradation to how communities are impacted by tourism through issues like climate change. And in relation to justice research, we've also seen some really brilliant work on political economic dimensions of tourism development that I think quite closely parallels justice research. And this work has been really important in helping to understand how tourism or how issues like community marginalization, the depletion of environmental resources is shaped by really quite complex entanglements between tourism, diverse industries, political geographies, and societies. So we wanted to be able to bring these different perspectives together that have emerged over time and put them into dialogue. We have 4 speakers today, I think each with a unique and valuable perspective on tourism justice and human environment relationships. We are very grateful to be joined today by Blanca Camargo.
Good morning. Good morning.
Bobby, good morning, Blanca. Welcome. Nice to have you here. We're also joined by Bobby Chew Bigby.
Morning, everyone.
Morning, Bobby. Angus Hulbert.
Hello.
And Dominic Lapointe.
Bonjour.
So what we hope for today is to be able to highlight the insight from different perspectives on tourism justice and human environment relationships, while at the same time trying to draw together some shared understanding of what is needed to include community experiences with tourism's environmental impacts into tourism development. So in terms of format, each speaker will have about 10 minutes looking at the questions of how do you approach tourism's entanglements between people, place, and environment, and why? And what role does justice play in your research? In terms of format, sorry, if you're watching online, please, you can post a question or a comment in the chat function at any time, and we will collate those questions and bring them into the Q&A at the end. So every speaker will have the opportunity to present, and we'll hold our questions until the end. So, okay, I will keep things moving and move to introduce our first speaker, who is Blanca Camargo. Blanca is a professor at the University of Monterrey in Mexico. Her work has focused on including environmental justice and ecocultural justice in sustainable tourism, as well as a range of ethically oriented work on indigenous rights and dignity, particularly in relation to tourism employment. So Blanca, a really big welcome to you, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And what I want to do today is to share a little bit of my journey in this topic of justice, how I started and where it's going, and some of the learnings that I have acquired in working with indigenous groups, justice and tourism. So if I may present a couple of slides so I can keep myself on track. How how I started my first approach to justice was when I was a TA for Dr. Tassim Jamal. And my role was to accompany a group of international students to Yucatan in Mexico to learn about cultural heritage. And we were at the archaeological site of Chichen Itza, and I was seeing such a differential between the students and the local people. And it broke my heart to see 7 and 8-year-old girls, Maya girls, trying to sell their handicraft to a group of privileged students for $1 or 50 cents or whatever they could give. So that night I couldn't sleep thinking about what I was experiencing. And I couldn't put a name of what I was feeling. And my heart was telling me has to do with fairness, with justice, with dignity. And when I went back to the United States, I went to Texas A&M. I started looking at the literature on sustainable tourism, which was my specialization. And if we take a look at the principles of sustainable tourism, there is equity. So I started investigating, what does equity mean in the context of tourism? And in particular, in the realm of culture. And that inspired what was my doctoral dissertation, because justice and equity had not been conceptualized. There were a few studies that analyzed differences in income by gender, by social class, how tourism resources were distributed among class groups, or the outcomes of tourism. But there was not a formal discussion of what equity and justice meant in tourism. And then I made the purpose of my study to conduct a theoretical grounded and empirical driven study to explore what was happening in this part of Mexico in regards to tourism, equity, justice. What were some of the injustices that were happening, and why, most importantly, why they were happening? And based on the findings, I developed a framework to examine cultural justice in tourism. And why cultural justice? I'm going to go back. The indigenous people in Mexico, but not only in Mexico, but also throughout Latin America and from Colombia, they are at the bottom of the social pyramid. Here in Mexico, just to give you a few statistics, even though there are 11 million indigenous people, 50% of them live in rural areas. And what is really worrisome is that 70% of indigenous people live in poverty, 25% in extreme poverty. They lack access to basic social services. The life expectancy due to the lack of health services, education, access to infrastructure is 6 years below the average Mexican. So it is my interest in understanding why it is happening, and in particular in tourism destinations where they live. So going back, I made a journey to talk to people about what they thought about tourism and how they considered if tourism was just or unjust, and what injustices they were seeing. What I found in my time in the Riviera Maya was a disproportionate capture of tourism revenue by the local elites, but they were Mexican elites. Sometimes we tend to blame international tourism and globalization for all the injustices that are happening in tourism, but we failed to consider how the local elites participate in the injustices. Exploitation of natural resources and also Maya people. In this picture, you can see, speaking of environmental justice, in Cozumel, beautiful island with pristine oceans and beaches, but the local people have denied access to such beautiful places, and the government has just left them a few public beaches that are the ugliest in the whole island, and they just have access to it. Exclusion of local people from tourism decision-making, inequitable government support for Maya tourism, all the resources for marketing, tourism infrastructure, development go to the consolidated destinations such Cancun, Tulum, Playa del Carmen, and very, very little resources go to cultural and heritage tourism. Appropriation of local resources for tourism and discrimination of local people. And these findings helped me develop a framework to study cultural justice in tourism that is in my dissertation, but that led to a couple of publications that is what is called Sustainable Tourism Justice and an Ethic of Care Toward the Just Destination, and one that has to do with governance. Another part of my research is in Colombia. I'm from Colombia, like I mentioned, and walking the streets of Cartagena since my childhood, I always saw the palenqueras, which are Afro-Colombian people, as a feature of Cartagena. And if you happen to have the opportunity to go to Cartagena, you will see them selling fruits, selling candy in the corners, in the tourism webpage of Colombia, in magazines. They're everywhere. You can even buy souvenirs with the figure of the palenquera. And my question is, what are they receiving in return, right? Because their image is used, tourists go and take pictures with them, tourism imaginary is sold. And I said that made me investigate. How do they feel about tourists and the tourism industry? And do they receive any compensations for the use of their image in tourism? And what I found, and I published as a case study in Tassim's Justice and Ethics in Tourism book, is that they don't receive any compensation. In fact, there is plenty of articles in how they're being used and denied even the most services. Here is an article from the BBC. It says, I am considered cultural heritage, Darren, but I cannot afford to go to the dentist because they don't receive any compensation. In fact, sometimes they're denied entrance to the historic center to get their tips that they get from posing for pictures for tourists. And in all my work with justice, there was something, and the data was telling me something that needed to be explored. And it has to do with racism and classism within a destination. I'm going to show you a couple of quotes from my research in the Riviera Maya and how local people reported that the discrimination and the racism and the exploitation sometimes most of the time actually, was coming from other Mexican people. And remember that I said that sometimes we feel or we argue that international tourism is the cause of injustices, but sometimes we fail to look at the local context. Here's another quote. It says, the ones from Monterrey, which is where I live, is in the northern Mexico, treat us like if we were nothing and make fun of our accent. They come from wanting to make fun of us, and they tell us, what's up, Yuca? Yuca's a derogatory name for people from Yucatan, without even knowing us. Foreign people ask you know Maya? And they ask me things in Maya, and I explain to them. It makes me feel, because people like those from Monterrey are very aggressive with the Maya. They despise you. So strong quotes that made me reflect of what was going on within the destination. There are many people that made fun of us, mainly Mexican people that work with us. They used to say, you have a Maya face. You don't know anything. You are Maya. You don't even know how to hold a spoon. Americans treat you better. They ask us to speak in Maya and write what we say in Maya. They also encourage us to wearing the ipil. And reflecting on these quotes, I moved my studies from justice into dignity for indigenous groups. And that's the subject of another presentation, how I have moved. But what I want to share, what I learned in my journey, injustice take place at different scales, from the macro levels, global levels, to the micro at the destination. And the thing for us to ask ourselves is, what impact do I want to make? Do we want to work towards solving global issues related to justice, or do we want to make small contributions at the local level? Justice and injustices are highly complex and embedded in internal dynamics that are seldom discussed in tourism, such as classism, racism, corruption, power, politics. So we cannot examine justice in tourism as an independent entity without taking into consideration such factors. And specifically asking ourselves, what are the roots of the injustices we are seeing? Justice needs to be studied from the perspective of who is suffering. What do people consider fair or not fair? We might vary from what we consider as privileged scholars to be fair or unfair. And international tourism or international tourists play a positive role in bringing justice and even repairing dignities. And what we haven't not explored is how can we maximize this positive impact. So with that, I want to open the floor for questions. Thank you.
Blanca, is it all right if we save the questions until the end?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. We do have a question that's come in, but if it's all right, we can maybe move that to the Q&A towards the end to give everyone a chance to speak.
Thank you.
Okay. But thank you really very much, Blanca. It was a really inspiring discussion. The importance of scale there and local power dynamics, I think, is really important, but also considering how that needs to be scaled up and understanding justice was a really important point. And your the quotes and images really come through in sharing the stories. So thank you very much for that. Okay, I will move over to our second speaker now, who is Bobby Chew Bigby. Bobby is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Waterloo. Bobby's work has centered around themes of justice, environment, and tourism, but I think looking particularly at tourism and tourism as a local and global social force that can enable environmental responsibility, community equity, amongst other things. So welcome, Bobby. Thank you very much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Michael. I appreciate it. Just wanting to check. There we go. About slides. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone from wherever you're joining. Today, I'm joining you from my home on the Muskogee Creek Nation Reservation in Oklahoma. And again, my name is Bobby Chew Bigby, and I just really want to thank Michael and his team for the invitation to be able to join this dialogue today. When thinking about the concept of justice, and I guess at what point, my work started kind of intersecting with it, but I think going even further back of when it first came upon my radar, I couldn't really answer that question. But what I could answer was when I began to start to feel, specifically not justice, but injustice. And this really came with an early tour experience that I had. So I want to take you all back to 2003. I was a high school exchange student learning Spanish, and I was sent during that summer to the South American country of Bolivia. There I lived with a host family and, studied Spanish intensively, but was also learning about the indigenous Aymara and Quechua cultures. And one of the tour experiences that they took us on was in the town of Potosi that sits at one of the highest elevations in the world. And why Potosi has been so significant, not just in the Americas, but in the world, is because you see here this image at the left is Cerro Rico, or, the rich mountain that really has been the source, one of the greatest sources of silver in the world since, the beginning of the Spanish conquest in the 1500s. But the incredible and horrifying thing is that to this day, silver and other minerals are still extracted from Cerro Rico, mostly by hand and by indigenous Quechua and Aymara men and young boys who've been working there over their generations. And so with this student group, we were taken for a mine tour underground to be able to kind of learn this history about the mining, how it contributed to the building of Potosi, how the Spanish extracted that wealth and built the wealth of Europe, and then kind of built their colonial empire. But I just remember, like I said, I wasn't thinking necessarily in those terms of justice. I don't think that at that point in 2003, I could even really articulate or describe what I was seeing, but I remember how I felt. And I remember this just very gnawing feeling in my stomach. And the smells that were, you know, of just sulfur and, you know, seeing the condition of the working conditions of these men who were toiling away in, you know, in this mountain, seeing the environmental impacts of this that had happened, you know, not just over a couple of decades, but for over almost 500 years. And one of the things that we did, in addition to being able to speak with the miners and their children, the first thing we were actually instructed when we went into the mine, in accordance with traditional indigenous belief, is that it's viewed that when you go into the mine and you engage in that process of extraction, it is Tío Diablo, or the uncle devil, who oversees that underworld. And so you must first, as a visitor there, pay respect to Tío Diablo, or the uncle devil. And you do that with coca leaves and with cigarettes. So, like I said, I wasn't speaking in terms of justice, but I remember that this was definitely the first time when I really began to feel what injustice can look like, can smell like, on a very visceral level. Kind of fast forwarding now 20 years, and, you know, looking back to last year, in conjunction with the Travel Foundation and co-authors Jeremy Smith and Freya Higgins-Dabiel, really where my career has dovetailed, I think, most directly with the theme of justice and tourism, was a report that we were able to do, and research we were able to look at, specifically engaging the notion of climate justice in tourism, what this can look like, what it should look like, what it might look like across different places of the world. Since now, you know, as we're all very well aware, climate change, climate impacts are affecting everywhere. This is no longer just a story of icebergs melting or, you know, wildfires. And I'd say some of the key things in our research that we were pursuing was really moving beyond an idea of engaging with climate action, which you see here on the left. You know, we kind of articulated as strategies and efforts taken to reduce or eliminate carbon emissions, as well as adjust to the crises presented by climate change. So we often consider, you know, within that realm of climate action, you know, movements around decarbonization, carbon accounting, mitigation, and adaptation. In moving towards climate justice, what we were really trying to put a focus on within the lens of tourism is climate justice. And so we explained that in our report as when climate-related decisions, actions, and inactions negatively impact the least responsible and the most vulnerable. So we emphasize that this is it should be a focus on the leadership and capacities of impacted communities, recognizing that certain places have unequal responsibilities in their historical and current carbon emissions. And so really, I'd say that some of the two biggest takeaways of our report is that in having a climate justice push in tourism, there needs to be emphasis and support for fair actions on emissions, noting that tourism emissions are disproportionately caused by a very small percentage of the global population that is flying long distance or repeatedly, but that these climate change impacts are felt disproportionately by those who travel the least and who cause the least emissions. The second part is that we emphasized fair action on adaptation and resilience. So those places that are you know, what we would call tourism communities that are impacted most by climate change are often those that are the most heavily reliant on tourism, and at the same time, those in with the least capacity or resources oftentimes to be able to adapt or build resilience. So I'd say that kind of in my career thus far, justice engagement has really been explored a lot through this, this report that we were really proud to be able to collaborate and release last year. But taking it back a step, I think that through working on this report and being kind of immersed in more of the literature, the voices around climate change, around decarbonization, around talking of these issues of carbon and climate. I think it really kind of brought me back to my memories of the mine tour. It also brought me back home because some of the work that I've been involved with over the past couple of years, as I was winding up my PhD, was working with some of my tribal elders across our reservation and neighboring reservations here in Oklahoma to document the impacts of the mining that has happened here in Indian country, that has happened not as long as in Bolivia over centuries, but in the last decades, and how these mining impacts, you'll see these pictures here on the left of my elder Rebecca Jim, who's a Cherokee elder who's been leading these tours to places that have seen some of the worst mining impacts from lead and zinc mining, that have left behind chat piles that are laden with heavy metals and toxins that have contaminated the air, the soil, but also the waterways. And really since the 1970s, the company packed up shop, left the communities, in just really an environment that has been assaulted. And they have left, our living waters and lands in a state that really does not support human, animal, or plant life in any meaningful way. And so connecting these toxic tours to the idea of climate justice, I think helps to kind of push climate justice a little bit further, and helps us to be able to talk beyond simply, sorry, I think I lost my camera, but to be able to speak beyond just impacts of carbon or climate and think about things in a more holistic way of our role as humans in an environment that is alive, with lands and waters that are alive. So in reconnecting this to Bolivia and closing out here, that tangent, or I wouldn't say tangent, but this journey that I have been on now in looking more, yes, at themes of justice, but I would say also at, the impacts of ongoing mining and extraction, on the impacts on climate, on culture, on land and water, took me to Bolivia last year, again, for the first time in 21 years. And I was able to, with the support of Cultural Survival, a nonprofit organization who funds a community that is on the front lines of transition metal extraction with lithium extraction, I was able to document some of their efforts at looking at alternatives to the lithium extraction that is happening on their Uyuni salt flat in the southwestern corner here in Bolivia, and their efforts at proposing community-led tourism as an alternative to this new wave of what is called, green extraction. Our dependence on these new minerals that, yes, they may not have the same carbon impacts, but minerals such as lithium, copper, cobalt, nickel, graphite, and many others, the extraction is still extraction and is still having really massive impacts on people, lands, waters, and culture. And so I'd like to end there. But I look forward to being in dialogue with everyone. Thank you, Badon.
Right. Thank you so much, Bobby. That was full of insight. You managed to cover so much ground in such a short period of time, and connect it all together. So thank you for that. Blanca was just commenting that you both seem to have started with justice and your journey from a very visceral experience of seeing injustice live, which I'm very grateful for you for sharing your experience with us with that. But it also struck me the connection with tourism, how tourism can be a potential approach to addressing some of the injustice that happens in other industries, and this connection between tourism and different industries, I thought was quite important. And so an optimistic tone also to potentially think about. Again, we'll save any questions until the end, but thank you again, Bobby, for your discussion. We will move over to our third speaker, who is Angus Hulbert. Angus is a responsible tourism specialist at Historic Environment Scotland. That is the agency responsible for the promotion and creation and conservation of Scotland's historic environment. I think we're particularly pleased to have Angus here, at least within the Just Tour team, because Angus is I would say, semi-recent graduate of the Masters in Glasgow. And so Angus is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Angus, but I think Angus encountered justice research for the first time during his degree.
That's right, yeah.
And so Angus is going to talk to us about some of the insight from his dissertation, but I'm in a similar fashion to Bobby and Blanca, a bit more about that journey from developing justice research and then moving into industry governance. So thank you. Always good to see you, Angus, and over to you.
Perfect. No, thank you very much. Just, how do I? Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so thank you very much, Michael. Just to give myself a wee introduction, and yes, so yeah, my name is Angus Hulbert. I'm a 23-year-old based in Highland pasture in Scotland. And as Michael just said, I've recently graduated from an MSc in Sustainable Tourism and Global Challenges at the University of Glasgow. And I'm currently 4 months into a new role with Historic Environment Scotland as Responsible Tourism Trainee. And so today I'll be discussing how my research in justice through my university has informed my approach in my early career. And I'll showcase this and explain how these learnings have impacted my approach to working in a sector that centres on people, place and the environment, specifically within the Scottish tourism sector. So yeah, first of all, just thank you very much, Michael, for organising this. It's really good to hear from Bobby and Blanca so far, and I'm looking forward to hearing from Dominic later. So yeah, as I've mentioned, I've recently completed a postgraduate MSc in Sustainable Tourism and Global Challenges at the University of Glasgow at the School of Social and Environmental Sustainability. Through this master's degree, I studied a wide range of topics from sustainable heritage tourism, climate change, technology, and the economics of circular tourism. And this provided me with a really wide range of perspectives and expertise onto how to support the movement towards sustainable and responsible tourism within the sector. So for my final dissertation, I conducted my research as a kind of part of the Just Tour project with my supervisor being Anna de Jong. I chose to focus on the sustainability practices of whisky distilleries with visitor centres in Scotland. And I chose this focus because whisky is such an important part of the Scottish culture and tourism itself. Yet I noticed that very little research had been conducted in exploring the sustainability of whisky distilleries with a distinct focus on the impact that they are having on the local community and surrounding environment, as well as the global environment. And secondly, sustainability efforts within the whisky industry itself often appear to neglect social equity and justice, which, as we all know, are two key elements which are critical to achieving genuine sustainability. And so, yeah, as Michael mentioned, my dissertation was the first time that I encountered justice within tourism. And as we're all very much aware, sustainability is now a core element of modern day operations and policies. However, it does have its drawbacks, as it has been used inappropriately and it has been misrepresented through things like greenwashing. However, in alignment with the Just Tour project, I began to explore justice in tourism, and it very quickly became clear that justice needed to be at the front of sustainability as a concept that is actually harder to misinterpret and misrepresent. And upon this realization, I decided that I'd use this Just Tour frame, this just tourism justice framework, as seen on the slide, that focuses on 4 key justice dimensions. So the first is distributive justice, procedural justice, recognition justice, and restorative justice. These dimensions allowed me to kind of explore the unmasked view of the distillery sustainability practices and operations. So through my research, I discovered a deep tension between local distillery operations and non-local corporate owners. Through interviews, field observations, and social media analysis, it became clear that while local teams within the distilleries were committed to community support and environmental protection, the external ownership and conglomerates ownership often prioritized growth and consumerism. And in doing so, they are undermining social equity in some instances. And so my findings revealed that without justice, even the best of efforts can fall short. So take decision making, for example. On-site teams were making positive strides towards sustainability goals, yet local voices were excluded from higher level discussions. And this lack of procedural and recognition justice meant that sustainability efforts, however well-intentioned, risked being ineffective or even environmentally harmful. Then there was the issue of social media representation. Many distilleries marketed their whiskey with extravagant packaging, and this reinforced the idea that luxury and excess are inseparable from the product itself. And this not only contributes to waste, but it also sidelines sustainability in favor of consumerism, which can have a massive impact on genuine sustainability. And finally, I saw how external pressures led to green hushing rather than greenwashing, as local teams were actively working to reduce their environmental impact, but corporate marketing strategies discouraged or limited the promotion of it. And this may have been because there was a fear of brand reputation being harmed, but either way, the result was that consumers remained unaware of the industry's sustainability efforts, resulting in unjust norms being perpetuated and continuing to shape what the market wanted. All of this kind of reinforced a key lesson for me. Without justice, sustainability kind of remains incomplete. These findings didn't just shape my research, they also shaped my professional decisions and the way I approach my work and the choices I make in my career. So when I completed my studies, I knew I kind of wanted to take these learnings beyond academia and put them into practice as best I could. And so I worked on several projects. And the first project I worked on was with a small tourism sailing business on the west coast of Scotland. They wanted to make their operations more sustainable in a way that actually benefited the local environment and community, and not just ticking boxes. So I focused on a justice-driven policy that made a real impact. And so I wrote up a comprehensive policy for this organisation, including a climate change risk assessment, their policy, and a responsible tourism charter. One of the big changes that they made was making a commitment to local suppliers for things like food, uniforms, and even their technical equipment for the sailing boat itself, instead of outsourcing. This kept money circulating within the local community rather than leaking out. And on the environmental side of things, they installed a solar-powered water maker, which meant they didn't have to rely on fresh water from rural marinas, which was especially crucial, especially in the summer months when resources are already at their limit and potentially stretched thin. It was a simple switch, but it reduced their environmental footprint whilst also tackling climate-related social inequalities, as some of the islands that we were visiting were definitely struggling with water resources. Another project I took on after completing my study was a research project for a local community development trust. My job was to come up with initial concepts for a community-focused responsible tourism spending card, something that would hopefully spread the benefits of tourism more fairly, support local businesses, and of course the environment itself, and also hopefully encourage visitors to be a bit more responsible when they're traveling. So one of the ideas that I developed was a reward system where tourists could earn discounts at local businesses, of course, depending on what those businesses were willing to work on, by using sustainable transport or volunteering. So they'd get these rewards by doing things like traveling by train or volunteering. And this volunteering could be working in local garden projects or taking part in a litter pick, quite simple activities. But and so it wasn't just about perks, it was making sure that tourism actually gave back to the community and environment. By weaving justice principles like distributive and restorative justice, the goal was to create a system where local spending and visitor behavior directly benefited the people and places that make these destinations as special and attractive for tourists in the first place. And so, as I mentioned at the very beginning, I'm currently a responsible tourism trainee with Historic Environment Scotland, where I contribute to implementing the responsible tourism framework. I was drawn to this role because of the framework integrates key justice principles, or it reflects them, and it reflects a proactive approach that can have a meaningful impact on local communities and the environment surrounding our historic environment sites across Scotland. The framework is built on 5 core principles, the first being environmental stewardship, sustainable resource use, community involvement, maximizing local economic benefit, and finally, equality, diversity, and inclusion. And I'm only 4 months into my traineeship, so I'm relatively new, but it is flying past at a rate of knots. However, I have been involved in several justice-focused projects, or projects that at least reflect the values of justice approach that I've been able to recognise. For example, one notable initiative was a workshop that we ran titled the Circular Calaveral Castle workshop in November, where we were looking at a shared destination approach. This event brought together local stakeholders from Dumfries and Galloway to explore a shared destination approach, and the goal was to ensure that local voices were recognised and valued in shaping the development of a historic environment Scotland tourism attraction. With a strong focus on maximising the benefits for the local community and minimising tourism-related impacts, I was able to see a strong connection here between recognition and procedural justice, which was a really nice kind of reflection on what my work was, because especially as part of this workshop, we had students from the University of Glasgow who were of the cohort after me doing the same course in sustainable tourism. So that was a nice circle. And additionally, as part of my traineeship, I also have the flexibility to explore other departments within Historic Environment Scotland, because it's such a large organisation. And I've recently been gaining experience with a sustainable place manager and development officer to support community wealth building and place-based development. And this work, as I am learning, aligns with my passion for justice, as it ensures tourism enhances local prosperity rather than creating burdens. So yeah, justice has informed both my academic and professional journeys. It has shaped how I understand the complex entanglements of people, place, and environment, as I've been asked, which has become also extremely relevant in my work that I do, both with HES and outside as well. In my current role, I'm extremely proud to contribute to Scotland's sustainability goals by championing justice through our responsible tourism framework. I also have the luxury of being at the start of my tourism career, and I'm ambitious to embed justice into every bit of work that I take on in the future, and hopefully influence other colleagues and tourism operators and anybody else that I can to kind of do the same.
Thank you very much, Angus. I haven't had the opportunity to see and hear about all the different projects and policy work you've been doing, so that was great. Thank you. I'm pleased to see how how many different projects you've been involved in. But your dissertation, I think, struck me as having some nice continuity with the issues of scale that were touched upon before, and especially with Blanca, and thinking about the role of corporate governance in shaping what local distilleries, what constraints and opportunities they have.
Definitely.
Really nice to be able to see what different forms of justice, whether distributive or procedural representational, can look like in moving into industry practice. So thank you for sharing both your dissertation and the work you're doing in Historic Environment Scotland.
Thank you.
So I'll move over to our fourth and final speaker, who is Dominic Lapointe. Dominic is a professor at the University of Quebec. Dominic's work has looked at tourism development through a lens of political economy and capitalist expansion, particularly in relation to issues of climate change. But Dominic has also recently written about the concept of entanglements and helping us understand how tourism is interconnected to politics, societies, and human and non-human actors. So thank you very much for coming today to speak with us, Dominic. I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Bonjour tout le monde. Don't worry, I'll speak in English for the presentation. Yeah, I've been working on many aspects of tourism in the last almost 15 years now. But to start, I have a little anecdote on how tourism is much more than what we think or the dominant discourses on tourism as mainly an economic activity or a managerial objects. When I was doing my PhD on the environmental issues of conservation for a neighboring rural community in eastern Quebec, at one point, trying to write the dissertation, I went up to my supervisor, and I was, making a PhD in regional development, not in tourism. And I was saying, studying those national parks, who actually, were at a very violent beginning in the 60s, was quite complex. And then I went to my supervisor and I said, you know what? That thesis would be really easy to write if it was not for the tourism dimension. You kind of crawl into it all the time. And I promise you, I'll never work on tourism anymore. And, we're almost 20 years later. I'm still writing on tourism, even if in some ways, I'm writing on a lot of other stuff, So to talk about justice in tourism, following those great presentation and having to close, I didn't know I was closing, or I didn't remember it, but what I did is a little bit of a step back towards philosophy to kind of reflect on what is tourism, to be able to talk about justice, and how justice has been, like a watermark along my work. So first of all, I think it's important to acknowledge that there's a violent ontology of tourism, but violent ontology in the sense of Jacques Derrida, the French philosophers, and that can seem like a strong statement, but violent ontology implies for Derrida that violence is beyond physical act and arms. The violent ontology, as Derrida frame it, it's something that encompasses language and even being itself. And at the core of the ontological violence is the use of language, symbols, expressivity to categorize and simplify being, and we can expand environment, culture to making it, I would say, to be able to frame it within dominant worldviews, and mostly Western dominant worldviews. And thinking about the violent ontology of tourism, it kind of like turn around the object of tourism and make it to look at where it comes from, how it acts, and where it kind of belong within frames of transformation and power. Because tourism have a really high desirable status in contemporary society. That idea of a statutory consumption. When you getting involved in tourism, when you act in tourism, when you consume tourism, what you're expressing also is a social class. It's a status that you can like save that money, save that time to have that activities. And so despite that highly desirable status, tourism is also about dispossession, commodification, alienation, and reification that runs across it from its origins through its development and the transformation. We can think of it in the most acute example of brutal dispossession for tourism development, when we actually move people from the land to build resorts, to create, full-fledged tourism destination, but also to more subtle dispossession through symbolic values and effect in the transformation, in the gentrification of urban area, in the requalification of rural, I would say natural resources dependent community that all of a sudden we're transforming through tourism. And also, tourism as an emancipatory practice, as something that come from big social gain on freedom of movement and freedom from work, can also mean someone else alienation. So bringing all that together, it's part of what frame my look at tourism and the part of justice in tourism. And at the moment where you actually raise those, I would say, uncomfortable questions, especially that, out of academia, when you start to talk like that, your friend think you're an anti-tourist person who kind of have a higher moral instance, where I'm actually just looking at the phenomenon and all its, I would say, its different entanglement to environment, society, politics, and power. So I think that statement is really important to be able to then take a step back and see what happened in tourism. And from my work, I have that place-based perspective that is running through most of what I've been written. And that place-based perspective raised the question and how the place-based subjectivity, the subject who actually live there, who have a particular life because of a particular entanglement, between people, place, history, etc., is brought into tourism. And how this place-based subjectivity is acknowledged as something of value, something alive, and something that strive beyond tourism, and even sometimes despite tourism. And trying to understand that, as easy as it can seem, it's opened up a lot of complexity and a lot of challenges in terms of justice, in terms of how and whom can participate in the definition, the measures, and the development of tourism in place. Because if we measure tourism with night stay, commercial night stay, who it favors, who it invisibilizes, what part of the tourism phenomenon is brought out of the discourse of justice and the debate of justice, and finally, who gets what in tourism, and the who gets what in tourism, and the distribution of goods and bads in tourism have been quite studied within the impact assessment and the economic contribution of tourism, which I'm not saying are not relevant research, but they tend to have their blind spot. And thinking about justice within the entanglements of place, of subjectivity, of more than human subject, of history, of power, is looking at those blind spot, and looking at the discourse of resident against tourism, the bad tourism, the good resident, the bad resident, the good tourism. It's that really Manichaean perspective on tourism that we can see a lot in newspapers and in industry publication, but even in some, peer review papers, kind of hide really complex, entangled issues. So resident and local community, who are they? They are not uniform. They all have their history. They entangle differently with tourism, with place, with history, and trying to not essentialize local communities as a block who either have negative impact or make money. It's really simplistic, and we need to kind of disentangle those lines to see who they are and how they relate to those area. I have I would say a tendency to open up those reflection through the lens of the trivalent form of justice of Nancy Fraser, to go beyond basic question of distribution and allocation of goods and freedoms in a given society at a given time, to actually look at participation, acknowledgement, recognitions, and how it interact with the idea of distribution. My time is running, so I'll close with some notes of cautions as when we think about justice and tourism. Mobility is a right. Freedom of movement is a right. It's complicated sets of rights, but nonetheless, it's something that we have to remember when we are criticizing tourism, and also anchoring, let's say, immobility. It can be from coercion. It's something that we're like the lack of freedom of movement, but non-mobile identity are also valuable identity, because anchoring can be a choice. And for rural community, that's something that is quite an interesting, I would say, acknowledgement to look at, where some, I would say, some stable, anchored, immobile or less mobile identity are relevant identity. They are cherished, they are valued. And in a world where mobility and high mobility and kinetic mobility is really valued, what it does in terms of devaluing those kind of identity. And I will close with really, really, really notes of caution, is to try, it's to be really careful that place-based subjectivity doesn't turn into a neo-Heideggerian Hodering that claim primacy of place, especially with everything that is happening right now in our world. We have to be really engaging with it, what justice is, what it means when we entangle it with place-based subjectivity, because all of us, we all live somewhere. At this moment, we're all somewhere, and this somewhere means something. But to not fall into that idea that, because of your somewhere, there's a primacy of place and there's some others that are not welcome there. So I'll close with that. And sorry if I burst my time.
Oh, no, right on time, Dominic. Thank you very much. Really, such a rich conceptual discussion, Dominic. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I really appreciated your point on being careful of not essentializing communities, and I think this is an easy trap to fall into. The resident or different versions of the resident can usually are attempted to be boiled down into 2 or 3 categories, and the multiple identities that exist within communities and how they're changing along with multiple different connections to tourism and other areas of life is so important. But I also really, your point on kinetic mobility really resonated with me and seemed to connect quite well with Bobby's point around that asymmetry between who is responsible for driving climate change of a global elite where mobility is highly valued versus people who pay the cost for climate change who are ultimately not responsible for it. So I thought that was a nice connection also with previous speakers. So thank you, Dominic, and thank you to everyone who has presented your work to us. I think we can move over to the Q&A. We have some time left, so I thought we might start with a moderated question, just to get discussion going. To anyone watching who would still like to post a question or a comment, please do so. We will try to work it into the Q&A. But we can start with a moderated question, and maybe if it's all right, just in the spirit of fairness, if we work in the opposite direction of how we started. So Dominic, if it's all right with you, you could take the lead on this one. Okay, so a question I was hoping to bring up is, in your view, I mean, what are the most significant challenges to including community experiences with environmental impacts into industry and government policy and practice?
Wow. Yeah, I'm starting. Okay. For me, the most significant challenge is to translate complexity within those government practice and policy. The rural community where I work with, they have a high level, I would say, of kind of a consensual, because when you're a small rural community, you live together, but they are really more complex, and that complexity of how they relate to land and to each other and to the others, it's really hard to bring within. And also tourism policies are kind of, well, the word is not coming in English in my head, but at different scale, they act differently, and when you scale up, all of a sudden it kind of worked differently. So something that seems just at the really micro scale of the business, all of a sudden when you multiply it at a larger scale, it becomes unjust. And then at another larger scale, it can become. So those kind of scale of justice are really hard to kind of bring into a coherent policies. Yeah, that's what I would say. I'll stop with that.
Okay, thank you, Dominic. Angus, over to you.
I think probably the biggest challenges, I suppose, maybe from my perspective, is actually getting the community engaged in discussions and making decisions, because as long as they're not within the deciding power, you have no idea whether those decisions and policies are having a genuine impact or a positive impact. At least they could be having an impact, but you don't know if that's a positive impact for sure. I suppose on a slightly higher level, we need to make. This is a very sort of abstract thought, but and quite a hard one to put into practice. But kind of shifting away from growth mindsets, because as long as we are fixated on growing numbers, specifically in the tourism industry, where we're fixated on getting more numbers to the door and higher expenditure, it often is the case that the social aspect of that, the impact of that, is ignored, and so is the environmental impact of that ignored. So yeah, I think that they're both quite pertinent challenges and shifts, but yeah, that's maybe.
Thank you, Angus. Okay, we'll move over to Bobby.
Yeah, I think that in digesting this question, one of the first, the biggest kind of idea that comes to mind is this tension in my mind between kind of interrogating, like, what we actually mean by community and what we mean by environment. Because I think, particularly within a lot of Indigenous contexts, the community embraces our plant and animal relatives. There isn't this artificial barrier that I think is oftentimes in, kind of the mainstream context or Western discourse about you have social impacts and you have environmental impacts. I think within many Indigenous and traditional land and water-based communities, it really is kind of inseparable. And so, when you start to, talk about something as just having an environmental impact, given, the cultural practices, the deep embeddedness that so many traditional communities have with their land and waterscapes for, subsistence, for all aspects of culture and identity, you're really talking about just kind of an interconnected continuum. And so I'd say that for me is just a huge challenge. And then trying to speak with industry, speak with, government, is that I don't even know that we're using a shared vocabulary. And so I think it's really trying to kind of push beyond what we're talking about when we say community and environment.
Thank you, Bobby. Blanca?
Thank you. I have singled out three main challenges, two of which have been mentioned by my colleagues, but thank you. One of them is breaking the dominant paradigm about tourism that prioritizes visitation and revenue and infrastructure and investment over social well-being, environmental practices, environmental well-being. That's one. Navigating politics and power. Here in Mexico, the tourism departments, tourism ministers, right? They're political positions with sometimes people who are head of those departments are experts, most of the time not. So they're grabbing these positions and sometimes they don't know what they're doing with it. It's a lot of nepotism, corruption. So it's hard to convince the necessity of thinking about social issues, social justice, environmental justice, if the person will be not kind to listen to those views or just focus on increasing visitation and numbers. And also in Latin America, and I speak to countries in South America, Mexico, where I have experience, breaking the racism and classism that prevents local people from being considered equal partners with meaningful things to contribute to local decision making. There was a question about roles, and if I incorporated roles in my research, I did. And if I may show just how roles inform, can I do that, Amy? Share one slide. When I was investigating the distribution, in this case of, oh no, it's not uploaded the correct one. But anyway, you can take it out. Roles helped me investigate how tourism marketing resources were distributed among different regions in Riviera Maya. And what I found was that most of the resources were given to already consolidated destinations. So that helped me see who was getting what, like Dominic was saying, but not the why. Why are some regions getting more? What is the Maya people not getting zero resources? So I have to delve more in depth about the reasons. And what I found was that they were not even considered intelligent people who could manage their own resources. They're noble, they're hardworking, they're on time. But and these are words from my respondents, government respondents, but they don't know how to handle a budget. They don't know how to, manage a destination. So unless we start seeing local people, in particular, indigenous people, as equal partners in tourism decision making, there will not be justice.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, to answer. I'll pick up there in thinking of keeping the challenges you've identified. If we can think a little bit more practically around what we might do about that. The next question I was hoping to ask is, what research areas or practice approaches will justice research need to develop going forward and to meet those challenges you've just discussed? Dominic, is it all right if we start with you again? We'll just
Well,
give Blanca breaks, and she's just answered.
What research area or practices approach will justice research to develop going forward in order to meet those challenges? That's a really good question. In terms of research areas, I think we need to go in philosophy. We need to go, but not just Western classic philosophy of justice, a much broader and a knowledge, a diversity of way of framing justice. And also we need to, sorry for maybe it's a little strong, but we need to explode the disciplinary boundaries in academia. The political science people thinking about justice and economy could think about distribution. That creates, a schizophrenic thinking, I think so, personally. Well, in tourism, we're having a tradition of post-disciplinarity and multidisciplinarity. I think that's a really, really, really important one. And give voice to the people we're working with.
Okay. Angus, over to you.
Yeah, I think focusing on an action-based research is quite important. So that, I suppose, could involve collaborative research, working with the local communities that are being impacted or researched, so that there's actions resulting from it. Because I think there's a large issue with the sort of academia gap between research and practice and what is found and what actually happens on the ground and within these communities, and closing that gap I think is really crucial. But I think research can play a really key role in doing so by going for these like collaborative approaches, and that's what I saw in my work with where we looked at the shared destination approach, where we brought local stakeholders together, and the value that brought to the individuals who came along to those workshops was immense. They felt included. They felt their voices were heard, and that was a nice action-based sort of approach. And I think future research in justice needs to be action-based and have results, I suppose, at the end of it, or goals that are hoped to achieve. Try to close that gap between research and action.
Thank you, Angus. Bobby?
Yeah, I would agree with my other panelists, starting with Dominic, about really trying to kind of tear down, the walls, the silos between disciplines, that we need to be able to be talking to each other. I'd be echoing Blanca about, really including Indigenous voices, but just all diverse voices need to be front and center in, informing these areas and approaches. But I'd also echo Angus in terms of things need to be practical and action oriented. And so I think that one of those things is, going back to tourism that is done well and with community, but I think that often doesn't get as much support as it should. And so an example, kind of from some of my own experiences, have been toxic tours. And one thing that I think I forgot to mention, during my presentation is that a toxic tour is normally defined as being non-commercial, right? So it's not even for the purpose of, trying to generate revenue. It really is geared towards the purpose of transforming understanding, trying to generate, understanding and empathy and connection between people and place. And so I think that, certain experiential tours that are small scale, that are often overlooked, that are too often underfunded or, deliberately not funded, those can be practice approaches that have the most, have the potential of having the most transformational impact on how we think, feel, see, and relate to one another in the living world.
Thank you, Bobby. Over to you, Blanca.
Yeah, the downside is I get to come up with new things that my colleagues haven't explored. But I do agree that we have to give voices. However, I think, and we have over-researched the injustices, and there is a gap in what brings justice, the positive aspects of tourism in identifying what conditions or what factor brings, like Bobby said, a sense of empathy, fairness, dignity, recognition, respect. So we have, I think I believe we need to move forward from identifying the negative, but also the ways to maximize the positive impacts of tourism. Mm-hmm. And a second one is there is a whole bunch of things in the future with the impact of Trump policies in related to mobilities and justice and bans and discrimination, xenophobia. So I don't know where it's going, but it's going to be worthy of research and action.
Thank you, Blanca. Yes, I think we could have multiple seminars and programs on that issue. And it is definitely salient. Okay, thank you for everyone for your answers to those questions. We have a question coming from the audience that is, so the idea of place-based subjectivities is interesting. How do we balance, this is coming from Anna, how do we balance consideration of justice between mobile communities and communities anchored in place without giving primacy to groups? So this is partially related to what Blanca was just saying as well. Blanca, would you like to start us off this time?
I will have Dominic answer that question.
Sounds great.
I need time to think about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a big question. There's no, I think we need to think about that. I don't have a definitive answer. We have to kind of pedal back to look at why we're in the situation where we are. Rights and politics have been associated with place-based subjectivity. You vote in a district, in a lot of places, and that distribution of power through places has been really, I would say, weave into Western politics, and that creates that importance, that political relay to, I would say, place-based living. But in the states, the Western state, in the Westphalian understanding, it's never been comfortable with mobile population, force. My English is rusted. Sedentarization have been, a common thing throughout the 200 last years of Western politics in a lot of areas, and especially in settler states. So, but then mobility now is part of of the world where we're in, and it does raise questions of how we define who's the subjects of justice, in relation to land, and there's no easy answer to that. And I think we need new forum. Maybe there's some answers that we can go with, going back to some of Habermas' thinking on, communication, acting, agir communicationnel in French. I don't know how they translate it in English, but I think it's one of the challenge of politics of the 21st century, and not just for tourism, with refugee, with migration, and because that intersection of mobility that is voluntary, that is wanted, or that is non-voluntary or unwanted, or even coercive mobility, coercive mobility, are all intersecting with place-based subjectivity. And how we create a sphere of justice, to borrow from Walzer, to actually not fall back and not having a repeat of some of the atrocity of the 20th century and of the 19th century, is one of the biggest challenge of our time. And that goes beyond tourism. But we need to try to formulate solution and answer to that. Sorry to be a little bit on the downside and not offering really answer.
If there's anyone else who wants to have a go at answering this, please go ahead. But there is another question we can move on to. This one is, I can't see the names, but from David Flood. So again, anyone who feels like they want to answer, please have a go. Maybe Blanca, if you want to start us off here. The question is, building on the violent ontology of tourism is quite an interesting take. It is then more necessary to learn from more necessary to learn from resistances of indigenous people, even if it means no tourism at all in their territories?
I do believe quite the opposite. I do believe that tourism can be the vehicle to learn, to promote, and to contribute to the resistance, not only of indigenous groups, but other minorities or people who have suffered harm. For example, in the class I taught last semester called Tourism Models for Social Justice, the students developed tourism proposals to teach and raise awareness about corruption in Mexico, about the resistance of the Zapatista movement in Chiapas, and the murder of 41 students in the state of Guerrero. So I don't think they're contradictory. I think it's a vehicle and it's a good way to strengthen and contribute to the resistance of indigenous and other minorities people.
Anybody else want to have an answer they want to have a go at?
I would agree with Blanca that, with a lot of the communities, indigenous communities, with I've collaborated, including my own tribe, and kind of documenting our cultural tourism building, that, tourism, I think in the last couple of decades in particular, has been embraced by a lot of indigenous communities worldwide, for its potential as a vehicle beyond just being, for economic self-sufficiency. But as a vehicle for cultural transmission, for land management, for exerting governance, in particular ways that perhaps indigenous people could not before. At the same time, though, I would say that, my approach is always that indigenous communities, councils always have the last word at the end of the day, and the agency. And so, if there is a community that feels that tourism is a hard no, I know we saw that quite a bit during COVID, which was understandable. And in a lot of places, tourism was a hard no, but particularly for indigenous communities that are in more remote areas had, just more difficult access to health services and things like that. And tourism just may not be the right priority for every different Indigenous community at every time. And so I think for me, the agency always rests with the community of, you know, whether tourism is appropriate or not. But I would agree with Blanca that I am hearing from many, many more communities that it's being utilized as a vehicle for just a whole lot of different Indigenous aims and priorities and values.
Dominic or Angus, would you like to try to answer that?
I think Bobby and Blanca have given a great answer to that. Thanks.
Agreed.
To add is that the right to know tourism is something that can be, more into the discussion. And, you know, Emma Lee's talking a lot about that, you know, and I know that art note that some Indigenous community have brought. I think that can be inspiring when we think about what it means to dwell in the pleasure of periphery for other non-Indigenous community, but that are facing those challenges. You know, working with an archipelago that receives 60,000 tourists every year, at one point talking about the future of their development, who was working on their development strategy, I asked them, what are the tools that you have to open the tap of tourism? They had many tools, you know. Which tools do you have to close it down? They don't. You know, and that's where touristifying into commodifying place, culture, etc. We have lots of tools within contemporary capitalism to do that, and it's wanted, socially acceptable. But trying to turn the tap off, it's infringing mobility, which in Canada is a constitutional right. And so we have two different regimes of values, of meaning, and of rights that are play against each other. And that's where, you know, bringing in the conversation, what could be the tool, you know, for no tourism or less tourism, or could be interesting. And I think Indigenous communities and the way they've brought those discussion can be really informative and inspiring for non-Indigenous community too.
I think that is a brilliant point to end on there, Dominic. Building the tools for turning or slowing the taps is a nice way to conclude the seminar today. I'm very conscious of time, and I think we will have to wrap up here. So I just, again, want to thank all of the panelists for your really insightful discussions and presentations. I speak for everyone in saying we've gained a lot of insight that we can take forward with us today. I also want to thank our events team for being so great in organizing and running the seminar behind the scene. We really appreciate it. A quick note that our next seminar will be in a couple of months' time, where we'll focus on post-humanist perspectives on tourism and justice. So please do keep an eye out for that, and we hope you tune in here for that in a couple of months. So again, thank you to our panelists and to everyone watching online. We hope you have a great rest of your day, evening, wherever it may be.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.